So of the essential knowledge, the fourth point to understand is called mapping. Mapping is such a powerful thing, and it's everywhere. Based on what we said in the first few points, I think it's clear that everything is the unified field. I'm the unified field. You're the unified field. This cup is the unified field. And therefore, it follows that I am this cup. Now, mapping is a term that I took from my studies in mathematics, where there's simple mappings where something maps on to something else. It's a formula. And so there's a formula that shows how I map onto the unified field. It is a complex formula. Nobody knows it, mathematical formula. But nevertheless, it's got to be there. I am the unified field. And this cup is the unified field. Therefore, I am this cup. So you can say, I map onto the unified field and then map onto this cup. It's a mapping. I map onto the cup. There are very simple examples of mappings. Everything maps onto everything else. One very simple mapping is reflexology. When I lived in Philippines, Manila, for about a year. And I used to go see the Chinese doctors in Chinatown in Manila. And there was this one Chinese doctor that did nothing but reflexology. What he would do was he'd take a little probe if you went to see him, and he'd push on your foot with the probe. And if you told him what was wrong with you, he got angry. He was supposed to tell you what was wrong with you based on what hurt when he pushed on your foot, where it hurt. The big toe mapped onto the head. The heel mapped onto the pelvis. He had a whole map on the foot that mapped onto the whole body. And then he'd be able to tell you, based on where it hurt, what was wrong. And then he'd proceed to heal it by grinding on it until the pain went away. But it worked. It's based on a principle called mapping. Now we're going to jump from that very simple form of mapping to something incredibly profound. And if you can really find this in yourself, it's going to take some reflection. But if you can find it within yourself, it'll transform your world. I think probably a number of people have gone and seen in the Vedic temples, you know, the pundits doing what's called a puja or a havan, you know, different ceremonies that they do. Those ceremonies were cognized by the ancient rishis. And it's all a technology of the unified field based upon mapping. So when they do these ceremonies, a flower isn't just a flower maps onto something in the unified field. You see? Coconut maps onto another quality unified field. And then every gesture, every movement, everything they do in these ceremonies is a technology that by, if you will, manipulating these different incense sticks and what have you in a particular way, it correlates to and maps onto a technology within the depth of existence. Just as with electricity, you take the electricity and you run the electrons certain ways through different things, and it has an effect, and you get lights or you get telephones or television or whatever. But the point is that these technologies of the unified field are highly, highly sophisticated and very profoundly delicate. Because as I said in previous tapes, the deeper you go into existence, the more subtle, the more sublime, the more sophisticated, the more refined, the more delicate the knowledge becomes. If you have a hammer that's superficial and it doesn't really matter if it's got a dent in it or anything like that, But if you have a computer chip, one little dent, the thing doesn't work. Now, if people lose sight of that, when it comes to the technology unified field and these Havans and Pujas and things, they start to think, well, it doesn't matter. Because, you know, we have this picture of Ganesh and we like it, and then back home at the other temple we had a Ganesh, and so now I've moved here and I'd like a Ganesh, and so they take a Ganesh and they put it in a different temple, and the whole technology is compromised. It's a little bit like nobody would take an automobile and say, well, the carburetor is so neat looking, why leave it under the hood? Let's rip it off the engine and set it on the roof where everybody can see it. Because the technology is compromised. And like that, not in all temples, certainly not in all ceremonies, but there is a tendency to cut corners or do things a little different way, or try to accommodate people from all different parts of India in one temple, and all of a sudden that whole subtle science of how to wire, if you will, a unified field generator, a temple, is lost, is compromised. And the power is radically compromised, you see? Even to the point where it can become destructive. I like to say that if you're going to run off the road, you're better off in a little four-wheel children's wagon than in a Porsche race car, you know. Because let's just stop and think for a minute here. India is the land of the Veda. All those rishis cognize all that knowledge. Cognize Veda. Where? In India. So why is it that there's so much poverty in India? Why is it that there's so much disease in India? Why is it that there's so much suffering in India? It's because they have this very powerful knowledge. But just as Adi Shankara said, that knowledge is delicate. It has to be regenerated generation after generation, or it gets compromised. And it was compromised. How it was compromised, that might even be beyond the scope of this little 10-minute talk. To say it succinctly, some examples: recluse mantras being employed by householders. The whole physiology, it was different. The whole understanding of the whole thing became confused. And so what you had was a very powerful knowledge gone awry, and you were running off the road in a Porsche. What we want to do is regenerate the purity of the knowledge, that's all. And we do it without disregarding the intellect, but staying true to the intellect. It has to make sense. We can do it, but it has to make sense. When it's one of the reasons the knowledge was lost, is because in the past people have felt it doesn't need to make sense. And superstition would creep in. Superstition, colored by lack of discernment, which created, oh, this doesn't feel right to me, but it's not that it didn't feel right because you were functioning in harmony with nature. It didn't feel right because of your biases, because of your distortions, because of the limitation of your thought. And so you created rules of conduct, rules to follow for unified field technologies that weren't based on truth, they were based on distortion. So the time has come when we need to and when we can, when we're able to purify that knowledge and straighten out the whole mess. I'm not saying that everybody in India, there are people who have tremendous knowledge of Veda, but I'm talking about bringing it to the whole world, bringing it to all the people. So it's not just something that an isolated few here and there have, but the technology is something that all of humanity benefits from. That's what I'm talking about, and that's what we're going to do. Principle number 4, mapping, the power of mapping.